Before we get into this, I appreciate you. There's a lot going on, and we've got a lot of board members that want to be excused and need to be excused. So we apologize for that. We have two different items. I'm not sure how much time the first item will take. We have some times in here, but it might not hurt that we have our second presenter on deck and ready in case this is a little shorter than what's scheduled. So, Vice Chair Ellis, can you shoot a text to have somebody on deck? Oh, there she is. Oh, I'm having to look through 1, 2, 3 people to find you. There you go. There you are. All right. Okay, I'm going to turn the time over to Superintendent Dixon to do this introduction and make sure we can get everything up on the system.
Deputy Norman, can you help get Dr. Rohr connected to the screen? So I'd like to introduce to you somebody that's very important in my life, and as well as someone who has a great influence in education policy in this state. Dr. Andrea Rohr is the director of the Utah Education Policy Center, and she was also one of my professors in my doctoral program, and really was instrumental in working on getting me through my program, and gave me great feedback, and somebody I came to respect and admire very much so. And so she now heads an organization that does very good work on educational policy research. And recently, Chair Huntsman and I were at an Education Excellence Commission of the Governors, and Dr. Rohr presented this information on teacher retention. And both Chair Huntsman and I thought it would be really helpful for the board to hear this presentation as you really get into licensure, redoing licensure policy and thinking about teacher recruitment and preparation and retention. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Rohr.
Let me turn this back on. Now, will this presentation, Superintendent, will it be, is it on our docs?
It is.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
I didn't.
Or it should be.
Okay. I just want to make sure that the board members all have access. There's really good data in it. And I also want to say it was a great presentation that I saw of yours do. It's very well done.
Thank you very much.
Worthy of the board seeing that. So
we get pretty excited talking about data, so we appreciate you entertaining this. And thank you, Dr. Norman, for helping me set up and for you all not having to see everything else that was on my screen. I didn't realize it would take over all at once. So we're going to talk a little bit about largely the Ecap survey, so the Educator Career and Pathway Survey that the Utah Education Policy Center put together in collaboration with the State Board of Education staff, including the leadership with Diana Sudreth, Travis Rawlings, Liz Hitch, and others who are working on your initiative for the Network for Transforming Educator Preparation. And so this particular, what we're going to go over today, is an extension of the work that we started in collaboration with the State Board approximately a year and a half ago. What you'll see on the screen, and this is available on the Utah Education Policy Center site, and I think some are linked from your website as well. These are a sample of the reports that we have conducted and published, again in collaboration with the State Board of Education, identifying who's leaving, who's coming into education, and where they're going, what's happening to them, and why. And what's important about this slide is to show that I think when we look nationally, though there are states who highlight, for example, in North Carolina, they do an annual report on who's staying, moving, and leaving and why. Most states are not giving the concerted attention that Utah is to this issue, and that is in a systemic way, in that their state boards of education or equivalent are not looking at this issue. They don't have, in thinking concentric circles, they don't have groups and organizations that are working collaboratively with one another and building onto the work that one another are doing in the same way that Utah is. And so I think it's important to see that we're impacting what's going on in the state by informing what we're doing through the use of data analysis. Here, this was the initial report, and this is just to get everybody to the same place in terms of context going into the Ecaps report. Our initial study was looking at one cohort from 13-14 to 14-15, and as you can see, for that one cohort, and this is important because the data change as we look longitudinally, First, we had about 19% of those in the cohort between 13-14 and 14-15 who were moving to a new school or leaving. So of those in that category, 12% left teaching altogether, while 7 moved to a different school. In terms of the school type and who had the higher turnover rate, and I don't think this is any surprise because I've heard you all discuss this as well, we see higher turnover in charter schools as compared to our traditional public schools. Again, both obviously are public schools, but the churn that we're seeing in charter schools is much higher than that in their traditional counterparts. And then in terms of Title I status, so whether or not the school is identified or has a large proportion of students in and around poverty, and who qualify for free and reduced lunch, we also saw higher turnover rates with regard to Title I status of the school. So we continued looking at this particular cohort, asking, are there trends? Do we see patterns and who's leaving more often than not? And for this particular cohort, what we found is that the turnover rate for the 13-14 to 14-15 year, the turnover rate was similar for males and females, and though slightly higher in this particular cohort for persons of color, not significantly so, though we see that in the long-term longitudinal study. It was higher, and this continues to be the trend we see among those who began teaching at an age under 25. In terms of special education teachers, we continue to see, even in recent studies, that they are among the highest rate of teachers who are moving between schools and between districts as well. And for this particular cohort, and I just highlight this, that it changes when we look longitudinally, science teachers had the highest turnover rate, though when we looked from 2008, you'll see that they were actually, among the STEM fields, were among the lowest. So we transitioned from that initial look to, like, what is happening in the state, what do we know about it, and what other questions should we be asking, to looking at our longitudinal research of the cohort that started in 2008. This is the one that you perhaps hear highlighted most often, and that is, of our 2008 cohort, 56% of them left the field by 2014-15. Obviously, there are a lot of factors and a lot of external conditions, demands, and things that occurred in 2008 and in the subsequent years after that, or immediacy after that, that may impact this. So we are beginning now to look at cohorts that started in 09, 10, and 11 to see where they are in comparable stages and whether or not we see the continued depletion at 56%. Of the cohort that we looked at, characteristics similar to the kind of analysis we did on the first year, what we found in this case is that we didn't have similar patterns. We found that females, for example, were leaving at higher rates, so there was a higher rate among turnover. Persons of color in this case were actually still significantly, so moving from slightly higher to now significantly higher than white educators. And then again, that beginning teachers, those who began at 25 or younger, still had higher rates of turnover, which raises questions, as you know, for the preparation programs of which I am part of, to ask what is it we're doing to prepare, and not only prepare them for the field, but ensure that they are getting the supports they need in their first few years. Again, special education teachers who began in 2008 had a lower rate of leaving, but continue to have a higher rate of moving, particularly between schools. And this is the overall glance of what's happening with that beginning 2008 cohort. I draw your attention down to the secondary teachers for the math and other subjects. They were more likely to leave if they were math teachers, though they were more likely, similarly so, if they were science and math, to move between LEAs. And this is what that looks like. In terms of secondary science teachers, we have a lot of speculation that they are leaving at significantly higher rates than their peers. And as you can see here, while at 58% of those who started as a math teacher from the 2008 cohort left, their peers were at 57%. And interestingly enough, it is our secondary science teachers who had a lower turnover rate during that cohort time. We have not evaluated this, but one of the questions on the table is, given the intentional attention to who the science teachers were coming in, their preparation at that time, and the kinds of support they have received since 2008, whether or not if the question is, are we seeing a difference in that in terms of their turnover rates? So where did they go? Interestingly for us is that 93% of those who left the Cactus database, right? And for us, that means that they were not in a Utah public education, not in the system, nor in a public school. They could be in a private school in the state, but they would no longer show up in our analysis. 93% of them actually left public education in Utah, while 7% moved into administrative and or other specialist roles. Some of those perhaps in your staff here at the Utah State Board of Education, but others going into principalship and or district roles. 8% of them, as you'll note, actually were what you would consider stop-outs, and that they stopped for at least a year and then later returned during that span of time that we were looking at. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't guess I can call on people. Sorry. My apologies.
Board Member Stokes.
So this was the 2008. Is it possible to do a report every year and see which districts lose the most?
Yes, and because we released Ecaps, we have the analysis of Ecaps coming, and we are preparing for the fall to repeat this for what would be the 2009, 10, and 11 cohorts to see where they are over the same span of time. To your specific question about whether or not we could do district-level reports, we can. I know the state office has also provided that information to districts.
So you can make a request on following the request form.
I'm going to fill out a form. I just want somebody to give it to me.
Right.
Oh, I think, yeah.
Is there a
Superintendent.
form? I didn't even know there was a form. Where's the form?
So
I
while
don't look at emails.
while Dr. Rohr has this slide up with about the 8%, we were slicing some data in general, looking at teachers who leave and then come back, and it's about for teachers who leave the profession just overall and return. You know, we have that return to licensure route, but just returning in general, I think Kristen Campbell found that it was about 5.9 years on average when people leave and then decide to return. That's the average span of time out of classroom. So that was kind of an interesting piece of data as well.
Indeed. Thank you. So that takes us to what we call the Ecaps. That's the Educator Career and Pathway Survey. Again, this was done in collaboration with the State Board of Education and was administered, at least statewide, through the Cactus communication system to all educators who appear in Cactus as teachers. And that was sent out last fall in October. What we don't know is how many of them, for example, we found we had some firewall issues and had to overcome those. We also found, and this was important, we wanted to be able to give an analysis after the fact that told us, do we see differential move patterns or leave patterns or working condition reports from teachers at different grade levels, different subject matters, different locations, for example, urban, rural, suburban, things of that nature. And so to do that, we had to ask on the survey their last name and their Cactus ID. Now, again, just as a reminder, the Utah Education Policy Center has entered into a very strict data share agreement with the State Board of Education and follow all of your state protocols as well as University of Utah and professional standards for data security so that that data cannot be gathered or transferred to anyone else. And that's stated in the opening of this particular survey. It didn't take long before we received hundreds of emails back stating that folks would love to fill out the survey, but they did not want to provide their last name and or Cactus ID, and some in fear of retribution and others just in terms of their own concerns about data privacy. So we continue to work with Diana Sudworth and Travis Rawlings, and we'll likely be coming or will be coming back to the board to request a different method of administration in the future so that we don't have to ask that kind of information from them, but we can still still connect the information we receive on the surveys to their cactus information. We'll never report on an individual. It will always be at the aggregate level and according to standards for data reporting, which means an N at least at 10, and depending on the cell, it could be as the minimum might be 50. So, for example, we wouldn't report if we were reporting on individuals who identify as American Indian, for example, and there were 10, we wouldn't report that within one district because it could be identifiable, so we follow standards of practice. So I say that as a precursor to you looking at the response rate. We anticipate, according to USBE records, that the survey was sent out to somewhere between 24 and 26,000 individuals who are currently listed as active in the Cactus database. That gives us a response rate of about 11%. And while that may, if you've taken a methods course or you've read something with regard to anticipated response rates, one might have 20 years ago, expected a 50% response rate. Now for surveys such as this that are considered in the organizational learning category, we're looking at about, on average, 15% response rate. So when we add in the several hundred responses that said, we would have loved to take this survey, but not with you asking this information, we creep up to almost 14% in terms of responses, but they're not captured here. So. We did have, in terms of usable data for what we're going to report on now, 80% of those who responded were stayers, and then you can see that we had 8% consistent with movers, 3% were our leavers, which is actually high given that we wouldn't necessarily anticipate they were checking the email they had with regard to what they have in the Cactus system. 6% new teachers. This is really exciting for those of us in the data world, and I think would probably be for you, in that these 116 individuals we can now follow over time. So we have brand new teachers that, at least for this particular survey, that will be able to watch the patterns of behavior in their coming and going within education in ways that we've not been able to before. So with regard to the survey, and if you haven't had the opportunity to take it, we're happy to send you a link that you can actually take the survey as many times as you'd like as a leaver, a stayer, or a mover, and see exactly what they experienced in terms of the survey. But we wanted to find out what were their influences and decisions to become a teacher as well as to remain a teacher. And what you'll notice here is that there are similarities between the two lists, between to stay and leave. So in other words, what brought people into education as a teacher is also, in fact, what's keeping them here as a teacher, including the first, which is a desire to make a worthwhile difference in the lives of children. You see similarities in the desire to contribute to the greater societal good, summers off or convenience of annual work schedule, and then also the subject matter interest and expertise. And then we see variance on the last factor, which is experience working with children and adults. And then for those who remain, it's the relationships with their peers and colleagues. And you'll see that come up over and over again. We then went from asking what brought them in, so they had a list of over 20 items they could choose from and add other factors, do a write-in response. We then started narrowing that list and asking what are the most influential, so the top 10 very and extremely areas that they are satisfied with in terms of school factors. For all three categories, stayers, movers, and leavers. And what you see in the areas that's sort of the taupe color here, or the lightish orange yellow, is the similarities between the groups. And as you'll notice, there are a lot of similarities between those factors that each group is satisfied with, including leading at the top or working relationships and colleagues. And then for those with the intellectual challenge, was among the top that they were satisfied with, even for those who left. Job security, collaboration with colleagues, autonomy in their classroom all came up as some of the top factors that they are extremely or very satisfied with. Yes? Oh, sorry. Sorry, I taught class last night, and so I'm kind of in that mode, so I apologize.
Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
Was this was kind of a multiple choice? They could click, all the things that they thought were influential in that. What were some of the others that didn't pop up as some of the top?
within these categories. These were what they had to choose from, and then they had, they could write in other. The total list that they could choose from had 30 items. So, and those, I can read them or I can send you the report that indicates, and those fell off sharply. You'll notice the contrast when we move in a slide or so. We'll move to those areas that folks are not satisfied with, and that gives you the next 10, and then there are about 10 that fell off in the middle.
Superintendent?
I meant to ask you this earlier, Dr. Rohr, so I apologize, but when I'm interviewing teachers who have left and talking to them about what would bring them back, they talk about great leadership, school leadership with vision, and we know from some national retention data that one of the great issues of leaving is lack of support by principal. Where does that fit in here? Is that part of the colleagues or value and respect on number 10? Where would you find that?
What we found is in the write-in comments that, and it includes not only satisfaction, but also reasons that folks are leaving. As you noted, they'll put other category, and we have paragraphs and pages of responses where they describe the leadership in the school as being a major factor, a primary factor in their reason to leave education and or the school that they're in if they're movers. And then they talk specifically, as you noted, about working conditions. So those are among their top reasons for both moving and leaving. And so we try to distinguish about colleagues. What we have are write-in comments about colleagues, the sharing of information, the working together, the collaboration that they have with one another. What we don't know, and what we will be investigating or exploring as we go, is whether or not those who are reporting that they're satisfied with colleagues and collaboration are these high, for example, are these schools that have high degree of professional learning in communities, for example. We don't know that yet, but we will be investigating that.
You've got to log in there, Board Member Lear, if you're going to play in this sandbox here. Board Member Lear.
I was just wondering where flexibility, I can't read that small writing well enough, and I bring my computer in to see if flexibility fits in there someplace.
It wasn't in the areas that they were very or extremely satisfied with, but in this particular slide, and we can also send you the reports, we asked about questions around autonomy or what they're doing, time commitment, reform measures. We had a lot of write-in comments. Autonomy in the I get to go in and close my door and do what I want to do hasn't appeared greatly on either of the list. It's not something they're necessarily looking for. We see more demand for collaboration and relationships with peers working together.
And I said actually flexibility.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Flexibility, no. With regard to the flexibility, we didn't see that. However, on this particular slide where we start looking at what are the areas that they're not satisfied with. So the bottom areas, what you will notice is that for each of the three categories, so stayers, movers, leavers, one of the areas that they are least satisfied with are reform measures. What we won't know until we finish analyzing the qualitative data is whether or not issues around they feel like reforms are stifling what they're doing. We see some hints of that in our early analysis, but we haven't finished analyzing that data.
Can I just have a follow-up comment? Is that okay? Quickly.
Your mic is on.
Just anecdotally, and I granted my colleagues are probably in my situation and my age, but among the friends of mine who are teachers or have been teachers, that is their single number one factor for I would stay, I would come back, if I could have some flexibility.
Correct.
So I think that's interesting.
And again, what you'll notice here are things like assessments, accountability policies, reform measures come up. Our question would be, what does flexibility look like? What does that mean? And right now, what we're not seeing is a consistency in that issue showing up, nor in seeing that folks in the field, that educators in the field, when they say, I want more flexibility, they don't necessarily mean the same thing across sites.
That's a good point. Thank you.
If I might throw I had a couple thoughts from your last presentation, and then they came back to me. I should have followed up on them, and thank you, Board Member Lear, you brought a couple of them back. When you had that chart up there that showed the timeline, and it showed a couple, well, it showed some trend lines. You can see it's kind of trending a certain way, and I don't know if you can.
This
that
one?
one right there.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, as you look at these years, if one thing on the, I'll throw the business side of things. As you look at a calendar, certain things happen.
Correct.
And I'm not sure if this is even relevant as you're doing this study, but from my point of view, I think it is. There was a time when the legislature kind of changed retirement.
Correct.
You know, if that was shown on there, you might see something. We talked about flexibility when the legislature really started that accountability, that heavy accountability piece. Where does that fit in here? So there's just some significant things that I think might be relevant to see how some of these lines that could be look like, oh, they're trending really bad. Oh,
right.
Well, hey, it's not so bad. What happened that year to level it out? Was that higher ed bid appropriation, or are you going? Do you have data that, or do you have other information that would support what I'm talking about? The timelines of what's happened. I'm sure UEA could easily come up and say, here's all these little milestones of
Right.
of difficulty that happen in the education community.
Right.
Is that part of your research? And
We think you're spot on with your questions. Empirically, we can't go back and test that because we don't have the data on, we don't have the micro data on, for example, when we can say teachers are reporting that they've applied for other jobs. Now we want to know what jobs they're in. So for the current administration of this survey going forward, we'll be able to answer questions like that. At best, and for us empirically anyway, we could just maybe look at and question some of the theories as to why we see these trends, but there's no way for us to even look at correlations between some of the reform measures that were in place and what we're seeing because we don't have sufficient data from the individuals who were reporting that they were leaving during that time. Going forward, however, given what we have with Ecaps, if we continue the administration, so questions like this, if we were to continue the administration of this or build the administration of this type of survey into both the onboarding and the exit for educators, then we could begin to answer those kinds of questions because we would be collecting the data on a regular basis, and then we'd have, if you will, real-time information about what policy changes were occurring. We'd have more specific information about why individuals are leaving, and we'd be able to cite, so when someone says, I'm leaving for another job, or I'm leaving because this policy came in, we'd have more real-time ability for that analysis.
okay. Board Member Stokes?
So I don't know if you're going to get to this in your presentation, but are we going to talk about entrance into the teaching profession, or is that going to be a different study?
As in the pipeline into?
Yeah.
I know that Envision Utah
Yeah,
has I haven't seen their methodology, but they have gone out and talked to teachers, and they have been looking at that a bit. What we're starting to do from our side is to look at the individuals who were prepared in a Utah-based institution and then follow their career patterns over time. So where they go from the point of exit from an institution of preparation into the field and then beyond, but we have not done that yet.
So if I may, do you have raw numbers on how many people, on how many, I know this is aggregated, and do you have raw numbers on how many people have left the profession?
The actual numbers? Yes, as does the State Board Office in terms of.
I know I have to fill out a form here. I'm just asking you.
We'll get someone to fill that out for you, Board Member Stokes.
We don't have the current data. What we will be able to report in collaboration with the state board is after June 30th, once the data have been cut for the year, then we'll be able to tell you what that looked like for last year. So it does lag about a year.
But you don't have any of the past years.
Well, we have, for instance, we have the cohort from 2008, and we know what percentage and numbers that are leaving there. For example, 56% of those who started left from the 2008 to 14-15 cohort, but we don't have the recent years.
Okay. Board Member Lisa, comments?
Thank you, Chair Huntsman. When it comes to the reform measures and the leavers, do they give any specifics? Is there any location where they can put specifically what reforms are forcing them to leave? I find this super sad and very curious at the same time, is because when I see the trends lift from the implementation of Common Core back in 2010, and I'm seeing the reforms of leavers. I'm curious as to because I've had many teachers come and say it's because of the reforms. It's because of what I'm being forced to teach now. Why can't I teach my traditional way? So I'm very curious as if you're finding that.
So we have started preliminary analysis of the qualitative data that were provided by participants in this study. Mentions, but not an overwhelming response at this time around, for example, specifically your comment about Common Core. That hasn't come up as a driver out at this point.
Okay. Board Member Stokes?
Was it one of the selection items?
No, it was, so what we did in the selection, the survey items are the broader categories, and then they had each time an other, and so they did write-in. So that's our qualitative data that we're analyzing at this time.
But it wasn't on the list.
No, no. We talked extensively about how specific to go with the list and whether or not to put those items. But in survey construction, you also have to be careful not to lead people to responses. And so the general rule of thumb is you go up and then down for the comments.
This is just a Spencer. You don't want to lead, but you had 100 data points. You had 100.
No.
Didn't you tell me how many?
No, here they had 30 general areas that they could select from, and those were built around constructs. So the constructs, what we were doing with the pilot is trying to understand whether or not we had the correct constructs. Are we even in the right area? So, for example, now we've done a factor analysis to determine are these the right constructs and factors, and then are these the right items to get at whether or not those are. And so we're paring down a bit. And the write-in comments, or what we consider the qualitative data for this, will illuminate whether or not we need to add specifics. So, for instance, in the comments, if in the end, for instance, Common Core were one of those that were the write-in, which at this time they're not, then we would include that as an item going forward. But at this time, it's not.
Superintendent Dixon?
Oh, I think he's got a follow-up, actually.
No, I was just going to say.
Your mic's off.
You turned your mic off. Now it's back on.
So I was just going to say, and my question wasn't specifically about Common Core as one of the items, but this is done online, correct? I mean, this isn't a phone interview. This is done online.
No, this is an online survey. Yeah, absolutely. And it does provide, I mean, the questions that you're raising are excellent, and our team is listening so that they can write those down, so that we know what else. We use these questions as a way to come back to you and say, these were some of the questions you had, and this is what we found. Because we are interested whether or not what we know from current research or current rhetoric and reporting is actually what's happening in the lives of educators. And so that's why this was important for us, is to get their voices to mitigate sort of the rhetoric around why teachers are leaving, staying, or moving.
Superintendent?
Yeah, I'm just going back to the timeline. This is connected to Member Stokes' comment. So at the beginning of 2008-9 was a year that I was over in licensing, and so that, if you look at the leaving data, it's around trending between 14 to 17%. That was a time in the economy when people didn't have jobs, and so we saw a real uptick, for example, in our ARL applications. We had, I remember it doubling that year, and for a couple of years thereafter, it just continued to increase. So well, you see a low level of leaving, but you saw, and again, that's mitigated by a high level of stayers because of the economy. Mm-hmm. Reform is also a term, when we talk to teachers, that's a lot like the question that Board Member Lear asked around flexibility. Reform can mean educator evaluation, can mean school grading, could mean new standards, whether that's from the Common Core or science or whatever. So that's another one that can be broken down into all those categories. Mm-hmm. So I think this goes to the question of, there's probably a way, is there a way then to develop a survey in the future that you can even break down some of those terms without being leading? I mean, I guess it could be
absolutely
some qualitative, if they mark a box, then tell me more about this. Because that would be interesting. When people say reform, what do they mean by that? Or when they say flexibility, is it they would love to job share, or they just want more creative opportunity in their classroom? So those are some really interesting data points to drill down to that you get often in conversation, but not always in this kind of data.
Which is why the write-in comments were important, because as we refine the survey, what will end up happening is some of these items will go away because they just didn't appear as important. The others will become routing items. So it is possible that reform measures ends up being, if you click that as something that if it moves into the category that you say you're highly satisfied or highly not satisfied with, then you click that item and then it opens up and it'll be a routing system to offer now 3 to 5 other choices.
Vice Chair Ellis.
I'm wondering if there is a way to get some of this raw data so we can look at, when they click on specific things. And I want to talk about the reform aspect also and what they've written in, because those that are proponents of Common Core use the definition of just standards, and most of the opponents are talking about an entire reform package. And so it's interesting because when I get into an in-depth conversation, there's often many areas of the reform that the proponents and that there's an agreement upon that are problem areas. And so that's why I'd be very fascinated to see what it is. And a lot of people, it's just that we're speaking two different languages, and so often we're not communicating well with each other on what our concerns are.
We will be providing further analysis, so the disaggregation, the turning over the raw data would in part be in contradiction to our data share agreement, and it's, but I think what you mean is the analysis of that information, and that is forthcoming, absolutely. Our intent, again, we're almost ready for the release back to the state board for our embargo process that we've agreed upon for them to review our first wave of analysis. And then what we would anticipate is that on average, there should be a new report released almost monthly starting in September. So,
Board Member Stokes, did you have another question or comment before she continues? Oh, sorry.
I don't know how to run this. So, can you go back the slide that had the lever? It had the that one. Okay. So this is just within secondary science teachers. Do you have one that has that has, well, you've got both secondary math, secondaries. So you're saying that in 2014-15 that, I'm just going to throw out an average here, that 50% of those teachers left, or just the ones that responded?
that's the cumulative rate. That's how many of them from the 2008 cohort had left by that time. Right, so it's a longitudinal look at one cohort. So as Superintendent Dixon mentioned, if you look at 2008-9, of those who entered the field, they had exited, in this case. If they were a math teacher, 17% of them who entered the previous year had left Utah Public Schools, or in our sense, the Cactus database, by the end of the 08-09 year.
So let's just use a number here. 1,000 people entered in 8-9. Only 500 were left by 14-15.
Yes.
Okay. I don't have any other questions or
Okay.
comments, so please continue.
So what we find, so we're asking this question about how long do individuals plan to remain in a position in teaching. You can see that a good portion of them plan to stay until either retirement or as long as they are able, and we don't have a distinction about what able means for individuals. But then we did ask, and we highlight those who are undecided at this time. And we think that that's a primary target opportunity for schools and districts, for individuals who may be thinking of exiting the field, and looking at what we might do to support them. What we'll be able to tell you in the next stage of analysis is who those individuals represent. Are they particular content area, grade level, locations, etc.? So that part is forthcoming. Here we moved a little bit further to about career movement and asking specifically about those who had either applied for another position in education or outside of education, and then we were specifically interested in a 12-month period and then beyond the 12 months. And again, you notice that we've got 60 and 69% who largely are not interested in applying for another position within or outside of education. It's the others who, for instance, not the ones who are applying for positions within education, because we're thinking, at least we anticipate that those are individuals who are moving into coaching, teaching leadership, or principalship positions, for example. We'll look at that in our analysis. But it's the 8%, for instance, that we're looking outside of education in the past 12 months, or the 24% who were looking, but in a time period beyond 12 months. Influential reasons for moving, going back to Superintendent Dixon's comment earlier about the administration and leadership, this other category we have started delving into, and surprisingly, administration, leadership, how a school is operated, trust, things of that nature are coming up within that other category. The second highest influential reason for leaving is the emotional exhaustion, stress, and burnout that teachers and educators are reporting experiencing. I'm sorry. Yes.
Vice Chair Ellis.
I just want to make sure that I'm reading this graph correctly, because I asked my chairmate if they could understand it, and I just wanted to make sure I'm understanding it correctly. So if I'm looking at the other category, you have not influential at all. That's about a little over 30% of the respondents. Yes. And so then on the extremely influential, that's roughly 60%. Am I reading that correctly? Of the respondents that said that was?
Almost 60%.
Okay. I
yes.
just wanted to make sure I was reading it correctly. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Okay. And again, for movers, these are looking at disaggregated results by movers. Again, our next stages are looking at what they were saying in their qualitative statements, but also do we see patterns in the nature of their assignment that may lead to this. We'll also be doing an analysis to determine how this information relates to other parts of the survey, to find out if we find more nuances that allow us that we can make suggestions and recommendations about what to address. There are things that we recognize, like location of position, or family relocation, that we may not be able to do anything about, but there are other factors that we can address. Similarly, now for leaving, it's the turn, right? So for most influential reasons for leaving, now emotional exhaustion, stress, and burnout move up as the top reason that they are leaving, where and again, we see a number of categories and responses, but one of the leading ones is the leadership influence in a school for other reasons to leave. So, excuse me? I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. So here are some aspects that we're exploring right now that we'll be reporting to you and others with regard to looking at the variations in responses by the degree, experience, subject matter, and level, variations in the response by school characteristics, and we want to keep those separate so that we understand what might be personally driven versus school driven, and then analysis of the open-ended responses, and then moving forward to refine the survey for its application for future administrations and utilization by schools, districts, and the state. I think it's worth noting that we actually have individuals who are getting their doctoral degrees and who are in schools as principals who have requested to utilize the survey as a means to address talent management in their schools, to better understand what conditions in their schools are driving teachers out, or what they can improve upon to improve the working conditions of teachers in their buildings. That's all I have.
Any questions, comments? Oh, Spencer's up again.
Okay, so, because you've kind of wrapped up, right?
I have, yes.
Well,
Can
we
you
have a
put-
wrap-up that we'll be giving you.
Oh,
so
sorry.
Superintendent's going to kind of wrap it up,
Oh, well,
like where we go from here.
so she was in your class in her doctoral program. Was she on time? Did she turn her papers in? Is there other things
Superintendent
you-
Dixon was an exemplary
I'm sure
student.
she was.
Yes.
So can you go back to your very first slide? Because I want to, sorry, that. There we go.
one?
No,
Which-
the very,
this-
very introduction one, the one
Oh.
before that.
Sorry.
So you are in the education department, right? You're not in,
I am. I have a few roles. So I am a professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy along with Dr. Nee. I am also the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Education, and since 2006 I've been the Director of the Utah Education Policy Center.
because I think this is amazing material you presented. I'm glad that Superintendent Dixon implored me to stick around and listen to it. I really am interested about the pipeline and what's preventing people from coming into the pipeline. And I am fascinated about the requirements to get into a school of education. Would that be on one of the university campuses? Is the GRE, which I think is the GRE, I think is required to enter into teaching?
No.
Into the education?
No, it is not a requirement. It is often a requirement for a graduate program for a master's or doctoral program, but not for the undergraduate program.
There's no entry exam to get into the education?
No, no, sir.
There's hope for you, Spencer.
There are, in getting admitted to a traditional
'Cause I-
university prep program, students will take the ACT, for example, but that is not a threshold requirement to get, that I'm aware of at any of our institutions in the state.
Well, I think you should check into it.
Okay.
I think there's.
No,
It's-
she's not. Because I know this to be the case because of my wife took it, and I thought to myself, it's the stupidest thing I've
The
ever seen.
GRE or the,
Well, she took the exam to get into the education program. I know you're all shaking your heads.
Well, I'm going to defend you.
is it
know you're
maybe an ARL program or, okay.
So,
Superintendent.
so at the time, probably
Oh.
at the time she entered the profession, part of the, or one of the options that colleges of education were using was that initial praxis. It's not the praxis 2, but remember it was the old praxis 1. And I would agree with Board Member Stokes that it was sort of a lame hoop, but it was trying to measure, do they have the academic acumen to continue on with an education program? And they, Yeah.
Wonderful.
well, they no longer, that's
don't
no
use
longer a
it.
So they
requirement.
claim. Okay.
Yeah.
We have a couple other board
So can I
comments, and
just
then we'll
follow
wrap it
on
up.
that?
Yeah,
So-
follow up.
So you do, Board Member Stokes, actually, the requirements are in our board rule. So the board has made the determination about entry requirements. So in there, it actually talks about minimum grade point, and then there's some either ors. So that's something that as a board you have control over, and that's part of the preparation work that you have leverage with. So it's always something you can look at. We worked with the deans very carefully to talk about entry requirements, and we actually raised the requirements at one time because Utah was being looked at very unfavorably by a number of organizations for either having minimal to no requirements statewide for teacher preparation. So at that time, the board did make some determination, working with the deans, to set some standards. And then there is a 10% waiver or variance if they have excellent candidates who don't make some of those benchmarks. So you set those.
Vice Chair, or not Vice Chair, Board Member Lisa Cummins. In my mind, getting old.
You may have already answered, so the question is still spinning in my head, though. Various responses of subject matter, is that just English and math and the subjects themselves, or are we talking more topics? I keep going back to the reforms, and on page on the 10 bottom satisfaction, it talks about the assessments, and I'm thinking, since the implementation of SAGE, turnaround, all of the accountability measures that have been put into place, are you looking at getting more detailed in that, more specific in those? Okay.
Absolutely. And so the student assessment school accountability measures, we do see some of those showing up in the write-in comments as well. But yes, indeed. Mainly it is around, at this point in time, SAGE. But we did get comments about the level of, in particular districts, for instance, they have more testing than the state requires, or how they're administering their testing or using formative tests,
Right.
And that was referred to as well.
If I may, Chair.
Yes. Follow up.
Yes, and that's what I've heard, is that on top of the federal mandate for testing, and then there's the state mandates, their added measurements for testing, and then there's the districts, and then the benchmark testing, and all. We're over testing our students, and we're over stressing our teachers. So.
And one of the things that we're trying to disentangle is how are teachers using, and I don't know that this will provide that information, but how are teachers using ongoing assessment, formative assessment, to improve or inform their teaching? But I think here what we're finding is they're talking more at the district and or state level.
Doctor, I appreciate you coming today.
Sure.
I know the superintendent's probably going to do a little wrap-up of so what's next and what to look forward to, but when we were really impressed with your presentation a month ago and again today, as I looked at it, the second time I was wanting to look at it through different lenses. I was wearing my board hat on when I was to that meeting, and then today I was bouncing around between the institutions to the person wanting to get in, a LEA's perspective. So I think this data and this work that you're doing is really, really important, and I had to almost discipline myself. Now I've got to roll back and say, okay, I am with the State Board of Education, so I have to look at this through that lens and not judge what these other groups are doing. And so thank you, because this information, the way it's presented, it doesn't slant towards one of those organizations. It's just raw, good data. Of course, you never have enough of it. Right. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And for coming. Superintendent, do you have a kind of a wrap-up?
I think we're very fortunate to be able to have this kind of data. I've been to several meetings where other industries are talking about their shortages and retention as well. So we have this overlay of an entire generation that doesn't think about careers like the boomer generation did. So they're hopping in and out a lot of careers and thinking about how do we attract and retain the current generation that we have and future generations. I think will be something interesting for the board to consider in this work to be considered, and then other professions as well. So I feel really fortunate that we have this kind of data to help guide policy. And with your monthly updates, Dr. Rohr, I know that that's something you said that you could put forward, and we have ongoing contracts with Utah Policy Center on a number of projects, so I know that Dr. Rohr and her colleagues are always willing to come and report and make sense of the monthly updates as they mine more into the data. Also, our Cactus database, I know Board Member Stokes asked some good questions about what we can find out, and it's amazing the database that we have and what we can get from it. And I know we've talked about it, it's only as good as the inputting of the data, but there are some conclusions that we can draw from the data that we have. So we're really fortunate to have a lot of these tools. We're improving on these tools, but that pipeline is one concern, but we know that it costs a lot more money if we can't retain the teachers that we have. And that's something that the board, well, recruitment really is of interest and something perhaps we can do. Retention is something that I think we can really impact through our policies. So we'll continue to work with the Policy Center and others to bring that information to you.
Thank you. And I would say you have such a wealth of expertise in the State Board of Education and the office, and the research that we're doing, we could not do without their collaboration and their perspective on what we're looking at. It is a healthy relationship, and that both sides critique each other and ask critical questions and offer constructive feedback about how to do this work. So thank you.
Thank you. Next up, do we need a quick break or should we dive right into this? Yay! Wow, that's a good report. Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute break.
If you take a break, we won't lose.
Oh, then we're not going to take a break. What's standing between us and a break? Chair Ellis, will you introduce, do the introduction on this, and I'm, no, I'm good. So I'm going to
Thank
have,
you.
if there's any discussion, I'm going to have you handle the discussion.
All right, thank you. For this portion of the study session, we've invited Director Davis from our internal audit team to come in and talk to us about internal audit and monitoring and how to help achieve the objectives of the board. And so as part of the overall communications plan and strategy that we've been kind of doing to try to outreach to the public, I would ask that board members write down their questions and hold them till the end so that we can use this material to then send out to our LEAs and other stakeholders so that they can have information explaining the differences between audit and monitoring and other technical terms. And so, I'm sorry, what? Oh, yes. And so, anyways, I'd like to turn the time over to Director Davis. And so just remember to hold your questions until the end of her presentation. Thank you.
Okay, well, it's nice to be here with you this afternoon. Thanks for staying for this presentation on audit. Maybe talking about when I was on deck in the back, I thought, oh, that kind of works with what I've called this presentation, the USBE's strategic super sweet spot. So now here I am in the batter's box, and we're going to find that super sweet spot. That's the intent. You have an information packet. It has kind of the details of this presentation. Don't like to put a lot of words on the screen, so the words are in your packet instead, and it's all available online. But moving into this, as I was discussing with my family that I would be giving this presentation, one of my brothers teaches high school age students, and he shared with me a note that he recently got from someone in one of his classes at the end of the school year. And the note, I thought this was relatable to audit, so I wanted to share it. He said, it says, "When I got put in your class, I wasn't excited because I'd heard things. But our class actually was really cool, and you're actually an okay teacher." So he took that well, and we were learning that some things are about perception, and audit, I'm sure, is one of those things that you've heard about. Maybe internal audit here with the USBE, or just audit in general, other audit shops. And so today, as we talk about audit, I hope you'll just be open to some of the nuances between audit and monitoring, as Vice Chair Ellis mentioned. As I was talking with my staff about this presentation, there are some terms that we wanted to define, and as I talked to them about it, it was a little bit reminiscent to me of the pyramid game, if you ever watched that way back when. So here's kind of, to define these terms, I thought, well, maybe we'll just use that as a baseline, but the categories are up there, but if I had to describe these to you or provide a definition, I might say things, and we'll start with quality control. So quality control, things that you do to ensure that other things happen. Would you maybe get to quality control there? Quality assurance, then, what's quality assurance? It could be things that you do to achieve quality control, or things that you do so that people will have confidence in your performance or the quality. And then total quality management would be all the things that you do, people, processes, policies, procedures, everything that you're doing to meet the needs of your customers or your stakeholders. And total quality management is both quality control and quality assurance. So those are kind of technical terms, but you'll see them pop out throughout the presentation. So I wanted to define them, and maybe to give an example to really make them concrete for all of us. An example of quality control, if our objective is to have healthy teeth and gums, quality control would be, I'm going to brush and floss. I'm going to do that. It's a management function. I take care of it for me, so I'm going to do that. So that's quality control. Quality assurance, then, on the other hand, is going to the dentist, right? An expert, not you, he's going to check it out. He might do an x-ray. He's going to look at that, and that's quality assurance, kind of a third party coming to look at it. And those things together are going to ensure that we hit our objective, we meet our objective. So what does that look like for education? And this is what we're terming the strategic super sweet spot. And you can see we have an axis there for quality control and quality assurance. So monitoring is like quality control. It is a management function, it's administrative, it's the things we do regularly, very frequently to ensure performance and quality. And then on the other axis is quality assurance, and that's audit. And audits coming in kind of like the dentist, third party, to say, hey, how's our monitoring going? What is that looking like? Is there anything we need to tweak? And those two things, monitoring and auditing together, quality control and quality assurance, work together to help us meet the objective of public education, which, and I've heard it termed several different ways, and maybe you'll explore some different languages as we look at our strategic plan in the next month or so, but maybe it's public education at every level, from the classroom, at a school, at the LEA level and at the state level, we are trying to maximize current knowledge, skills, and opportunities for our students so that they can maximize their future choice to benefit themselves, their families, their communities, and the world. So somewhere in all of that is that strategic super sweet spot. That's what public education is about. And audit and monitoring both play a role. It's hand in hand to help achieve that objective. So that said, I want to tackle, before we get into some of the details of monitoring and auditing, what I term audit confusion. And this is very real to me. Maybe it doesn't feel real to others, but what is audit confusion? And that's when we use the term audit for everything. It's monitoring is called auditing is called auditing, but audit is used all over the place. And why does that matter? And maybe showing you, so in our rule, R277, the board's rules, audit is mentioned 313 times. This is an analysis that my staff helped with that we looked at to bring to the Eliminating Barriers Task Force. But 313 different times within our rule, we use the word audit, and then monitors used 102 times. And as we went through and kind of analyzed, okay, it's used that many times, how is it being used? Are we talking about oversight or supervision or a very technical, specific subrecipient monitoring like the federal government requires? And then on the audit side, are we talking about a standard or an industry, or it's coming from statute, internal audit, external audit, state level, LEA level? There's lots of different things to consider as we're using these terms. So does it really matter if we use audit or monitor? Really, I would tell you, I think it's a board policy decision, a rule decision. And some of the things you might want to consider as we decide, do we want to tackle this? Do we want to make sure these things are defined differently and distinctly? Or can we just use the same term? Maybe consider who performs these functions, monitoring and auditing. Who performs them? What standards and regulations govern how we monitor or why we have to monitor and audit? And then really, what is the perception of our LEAs or other subrecipients that are being monitored and audited? Do they understand where we're coming from and the difference and what happens there? And I think there's a very real cost benefit as we consider the terminology that we're using. And if there's a process improvement that's needed, whether it's in monitoring or auditing, how quickly can we get to the root cause and get to the place where, hey, if it's audit, then we need to talk to audit and, you know, they can fix it. We can have a conversation there. If it's monitoring, who do we talk to go look at that and see if we can improve that process? So there is a cost benefit there. There could be some inefficiencies depending on how we decide what terminology we decide to use, if it's audit or monitoring. So just going to throw that out there for consideration of the board. But moving forward, I will be very distinct in using monitor and audit. So that's audit confusion. And maybe, I guess, one other point with audit confusion, internal audit, we find all the time, whoa, there's so many audits going on, you're constantly there. And so we went and pulled the data, and I think we've showed this chart before, but how often are we going out and auditing our LEAs? And this chart shows that we're usually below 20%. In some years, it's not at all, because it's risk-based and based on audits that are approved by the board. In contrast to that, and as we get into the numbers for monitoring, because we have so many programs and there's such a requirement for monitoring at all of our LEAs and with all of our subrecipients, which are in the hundreds, monitoring probably is closer to between that 75 and 100% of the time, every year. Our subrecipients and LEAs are going to be monitored, which is a definite contrast to how often we're going out as an audit function. And again, it's just a difference between quality control and quality assurance. So before we get into specific details, just a general comparison of auditing and monitoring and what that looks like. So I've outlined here who does audits, who does monitoring, the standards that are used, and the types of audits. So you can see there are annual audits. For the USBE, our annual audit is done by the Office of the State Auditor Financial Staff. For LEAs, that's done by CPA firms. And the auditing standards they follow, it's GAS, it's Generally Accepted Auditing Standards. That's a fun acronym, right? And Yellow Book is Government Auditing Standards. But it's a financial audit that we get every year, so we understand our financial health. And then the single audit, which is federal compliance. And then at the LEA level, there's a state compliance agreed upon procedure that's required. So that's annually. Those are done every year like clockwork. That's going to happen. In contrast, there's prioritized audits. And who does those? Well, the Office of Inspector General for the U.S. Department of Education or the U.S. Department of Agriculture for our child nutrition programs. The Office of the State Auditor, their performance group, their special projects group. They have a research group, legislative auditors. And then your USBE internal audit group. We do prioritized audits, and these are based on risk. And again, the board approves those projects that we do. The standards we follow, government auditing standards, Green Book is federal internal control standards, IAA standards or international standards for internal auditing. That's what my group follows, the Utah Internal Audit Act, and then we reference back to those general auditing standards. The audits we perform that might be prioritized are performance, compliance, special projects, research, or investigations. And then monitoring, look at who does monitoring. The U.S. Department of Education, their offices. Again, monitoring being that administrative function, a management function. It's the offices within the U.S. Department of Education. Or here are sections, CTE, teaching and learning, child nutrition. They go out, State Charter School Board has staff that goes out and monitors. And then we're also subject to monitoring by state finance on a quarterly basis. The standards that they follow are generally the regulations that are established by the entity that is giving funding or administering programs. So that's the code of federal regulations or the Utah code, and our board rule also has some direction on monitoring. And monitoring could be financial, programmatic, performance, all of those. And the frequency of monitoring, again, it is more frequent, but it's usually based on risk, and there's usually some kind of schedule that it follows. So every 3 years, every 5 years, we're going to get to an LEA or a subrecipient. Might be annually. State finance comes quarterly to look at our transactions. So that's just general, kind of high-level differences in audits and monitoring. So now we're going to jump in and talk in a little bit more detail. Or wait, no, there's one other thing, because there are other reporting requirements that we have here with the State Board of Education. So just to make you aware of these very quickly, Financial operations, they have due dates for different things, the annual financial report, AFRs, the annual program report, APR, things like that. It's on their website, that information and due dates. Assurances that we require, those are due in October every year, and that's in Rule R277108. Other USBE data related due dates, those are included in R277484, a good list there. And then I've also included the Office of the State Auditor financial reporting requirements. And this does relate back to some of those audit and monitoring requirements, but I wanted you to be aware that there is a list out there on the State Auditor's website of what is required, and this would be at the LEA level or subrecipient level if they're receiving federal funds or state funds. So now we will get into a little bit more detail on monitoring and auditing. We'll start with monitoring, and I will say I'm going to talk about monitoring more from the regulatory requirement level than actually how it's being carried out here, because as an administrative function, as a management function, the expertise, the best information on that will come from our section directors, Talia and Diana and Kathleen, all of them that are actually carrying out the monitoring that's going on, and our superintendents, he could speak to that as well. So again, this is kind of regulatory level, not the specific process that's happening here. But monitoring, again, it's quality control, and we're trying to get to that monitoring sweet spot, the best quality control that we can provide so that we're consistent and we're accurate. And again, moving there, so again, we can achieve that strategic super sweet spot for the state board in helping our students. So what is required? And I'm going to talk about federal and state. The federal requirement, and it starts out all pass-through entities, and the State Board of Education is a pass-through entity. We must monitor the activities of subrecipients. So it's a must. We are audited on this every year. The State Auditor's Office comes and looks to see how we're doing with our monitoring. So it is a legal obligation for us to monitor. And our monitoring is based on a risk assessment that we do of each of our subrecipients. So there's kind of a lot that's involved there. I have the 33 on the screen. The 33 is the number of federal grants where we expended money in state fiscal year 2017. That means there's 33 programs out there that require this kind of monitoring. So we're required to do that. And just to get a flavor for our pass-through and our responsibility to monitor. You can see some of the different state agencies here: Human Services, Natural Resources, Transportation, Workforce Services. And then there's us. We pass through about 92% of the funds that we get from the federal government. So we do have a significant monitoring oversight responsibility that some of these other state agencies don't have. So it is critical that we're doing it. Again, a legal obligation for us. So that's the federal level. Then at the state level, we also have a monitoring requirement, and this is just the general requirement. There could be more specific requirements elsewhere in rule and Utah code, but essentially it says that we're going to design and implement a consistent monitoring plan that includes standards for program outcomes and financial compliance. So that's our general standard, and you can see the number 45 there. 45 is the number on the 2018 Public Education Summary of line items that have categorical expenditures, or where we were appropriated money that we'll spend. So all the special education line items, the CTE add-on, enhancement for at-risk, youth in custody, all of those areas or programs are areas that we probably need to be monitoring what's going on there. Then in addition to the 45, there's also 31 more initiative type programs where funds have been appropriated, but it's not part of the basic or related to basic programs. So we're inching up there close to 100 different programs at the state level where monitoring might be required. In a recent audit that was done by our legislative auditors, it was the performance audit of the history of selected education programs. Released last fall, they said programs must be monitored and evaluated within USBE to be successful. They don't always specify in legislation that, hey, you need to be monitoring and you need to do this, but there is an expectation for us that that's happening. So federal level, state level, that's regulatorily what we're required to do as far as monitoring is concerned. So that's monitoring, and now we're going to jump to audit. which is my area of expertise. That's what my group does. So we'll give you a little bit more detail on that. But just as monitoring is trying to reach their sweet spot, audit's trying to reach our sweet spot also with quality assurance, and do the best that we can, be as excellent as we can, again, to help the board achieve that strategic sweet spot in helping with the governance and management of education. So there is a requirement in Utah code. It's the Utah Internal Audit Act that requires the State Board of Education to have an internal audit function. The Utah Internal Audit Act was created in 1995. And back in 2013, the State Auditor's Office actually did an audit to see how state agencies were complying, what that looks like. And they said one of the purposes of the Utah Internal Audit Act is to really help state agencies get in front of and proactively address risks that they identify. And we'll talk about risk a lot in more detail later, but just so you're aware, there is the Utah Internal Audit Act that governs what your internal audit section does to some extent. I wanted to introduce our department a little bit so you have an idea of who we are, what we're about, the things that we do, and then we'll get into the audit process. So, you know, I'm Debbie, I'm the director, I have my CPA license, graduated with my master's in accounting and went and started and worked for about 13 years with the State Auditor's Office. So going around to different agencies, Department of Transportation. Probably one of the funnest grants I got to audit was the grants we got at Public Safety when the Olympics were here. That was really fascinating. Lots of higher education. I've been to almost all those institutions. So I've been around, I've seen audit in a lot of different areas, and then it's fun to come here to education and apply everything I know about audit and really specify and be able to apply that to education. I have two supervisors, Kevin and Tammy. Kevin is a certified fraud examiner. He has the CFE. His background is also a little bit in criminal justice. He was a risk manager. He was the director for the Center for Assistive Technology. So he keeps us on our toes with our tech. And that's Kevin. And Tammy came from the banking industry, several years there. The banking industry, and then also the Governor's Office of Economic Development. And she currently sits on the Woods Cross City Council. So she has some good board knowledge, working knowledge. That's great. And she's a CPA, as I am, as well as a certified public manager. We then have 3 audit staff. Barbie Faust, who she came to us from child nutrition programs. She was there for about 20 years, helping with their federal programs and doing subrecipient monitoring. So she has a great background in federal grants management. She's working on her CIA, which is a certified internal audit certification. Then we have Wendy Whiting, who is a licensed clinical social worker. She has over 20 years experience in social services, worked for Department of Human Services. So it's a great background there, which we've drawn on her expertise several times. And she continues to work as a crisis worker even now. And then Lindsay Roberts is also a certified fraud examiner. She came from quality assurance, working at a credit union, so also has a great background kind of with the monitoring, and now we've transitioned that, and she's helping us with our audits. And then to round it out, we have Amy Hansen, who's our administrative assistant, and she puts the polish on everything that we do. She has technical writing skills. She's recently even worked on that with professional development to make sure it's just top of the line, graphic design background, and also international relations. So this is your team. We're actually pretty diverse if you look at internal audit shops as far as where we're coming in our background, but we believe that only makes us stronger because as we discuss things that come up, the diversity of background and experience helps us explore things and ask questions we might not if all of us were accountants like I am. So we believe we do have a diverse, strong team, and it really adds benefit to the service we provide for education.
When Barbie gets her degree, will she be Barbie Faust CIA?
Yes.
That's cool, CIA.
I know, right? It's compelling. CIA, I've considered it myself. It's a little more interesting than CPA. Just so as a comparison with other state agencies, how does our internal audit shop stack up? We do a lot of actually multi-department training and networking with Department of Workforce Services and Health. So I had this information back as of the internal audit staff numbers, where we each had 6. That was as of October, but I think it's pretty much the same. I've also pulled the annual expenditures, so you can see an expense to internal audit staff ratio there. Department of Health is a little bit of a different animal because they have an Office of Inspector General office that helps audit essentially their Medicaid program, which is $2 billion. So if you apply that, the 20 staff they have that do Office of Inspector General to their internal audit staff, they have 26 or maybe even up to 30. So applying that definitely changes the expense to internal audit staff ratio. So that's just a little bit to give a comparison and context as to how we relate with other state internal audit agencies. That's who we are, but what are we about? What are we passionate about? And our vision and mission are encompassed in A, E, I, O, U, and Y. And I think I've shared this before, but it's analyzing education independently and objectively for Utahns. And the Y is to ensure stakeholders can have trust and confidence in the governance and management of public education in seeking excellence for each student. We believe that really needs to tie in with what the board is doing strategically. So we always watch as there's discussions with strategic planning to make sure, are we in line with the board? Are we doing what the board would have us do? But ways we try and help establish the confidence and trust is by looking and evaluating continuing improvement and risk management, by helping to safeguard the funds that we get from taxpayers, also protecting our board members, our employees, and our students at the state level and local level, and then minimizing the potential for fraud, waste, abuse, and non-compliance. So that's our vision and mission. And just to talk in a little bit more detail about the AEIOU, so the first is analyzing education and the analysis. And data is so critically important. It's very important to us as well. And our standards require us to have sufficient, reliable, relevant, and useful evidence to back up all the conclusions we bring to the board. So we take that very seriously, that we're going to back up everything we bring to you, everything that we do, and everything that we conclude on. Then we have independence and objectivity. This is what kind of sets assurance apart from quality control, just in that we're not part of management operations. We're separate from the processes that are happening. So we can come in with an unbiased eye and be really objective about what we're looking at and the conclusions that we're making. So in that regard, internal audit reports directly to the board. You evaluate me, all that good stuff. And then for Utah, and I have to say this is the most exciting part, because education stakeholders, everyone is a stakeholder of education. I was flying back from a risk management conference on Wednesday night, and on the plane, the woman sitting next to me from Gunnison, we had a great conversation about healthcare, because she's a nurse, and education because of my job. And it was just so fun to talk to her. And everybody has a touch point with education, either because they were part of the system, they paid taxes into the system. This woman was on the community council, so we had a great conversation about what that looks like and the things that she'd done. So it's just so fun to have something in common with everyone you talk about or talk to, because education is just common for all of us. And it's so important that we're all contributing to education for the state. So our budget, what do we look like in comparison to the funds for education? The total internal audit budget, and this was as of December 2017, $4.7 billion. Of that, about $120 million stays here with the agency for administration of different programs. And audit, as a percentage of that, is 0.02%, or just over $1 million is our budget. Our budget, 70% is for salaries and wages for myself and staff. 15% pays indirect costs, so for the shared services like accounting and information technology services. And then the other 15% pays for other fixed and variable costs like our HR and payroll fee, rent and maintenance, our hardware and software, that kind of thing. So that's the internal audit budget. And where can you find us? Well, we are in the basement, but we are also online. So you can come visit us either place. I do have chocolate in my office if you ever need to come down, come visit us. And there's the Chuck Norris joke of the day. Also, I have that calendar. So if you want to come visit. So that's the department. But now what do we do? How do we carry out this grand mission and vision? So the pre-audit process that I want to talk about is a conversation about risk. And we have talked about risk quite a bit. And I think I've shared this definition before, but it comes from our standards. Risk is the possibility of an event occurring that will have an impact on the achievement of objectives. And this goes straight to our strategic super sweet spot. We have to know what that is before we can really and truly assess risk. We need to know. And I will say, from the risk management conference that I just came back from, they shared 2 other definitions of risk, and I kind of liked them, so I'll share them as well. They're not on the slide, but risk is the impact of uncertainty on objectives. So there could be positives or negatives. If we miss an opportunity, that could be as bad as a barrier that pops up. So we want to make sure we're not limiting risk to just negative things that are happening, although this one last definition of risk that I'll share with you from the final speaker, he drew a line and put a hash mark in the middle of it, and he wrote tragedy on one side. And he said risk management is what we do to make sure that we're not going to have a tragedy. So kind of more talking about things that come up that could be barriers to achieving our strategic super sweet spot, our objectives, but I thought those were compelling definitions of risk as well. So let's talk about risk management for just a minute. What is risk management? It is a management function, and it needs to be viewed through the lens of the strategic plan, as we mentioned, to find out what's relevant. There's so many risks out there. Any stakeholder of education could identify a risk, and they might share it with you as board members, with the superintendency. They could call our hotline. We identify risks, and there's a lot, and you hear us talking about the risk universe. So that's why I went with the universe, because we have a risk universe, we have a lot. But how do we know what's important? And that's an identification and assessment. Helps us understand what is relevant, again, through the lens of the strategic plan. So once we've identified what's relevant, we need to say, what do we do with that? What action do we take? So different things that we could do, we could just accept it. The board could say, this is our tolerance level, and we've decided we're going to accept this risk. We know with the slide, there's a planet out there. It's just fine. We'll kind of keep an eye on it periodically, but we're not going to do anything more with it. We could assign it to someone. Hey, I think that needs looking into. That planet's spinning a little weirdly, maybe differently. Let's go just, take a deeper look at that one. So it's assigned to a risk owner who might report back to the superintendency and say, hey, this is what's going on. This is what we're doing to watch it. So assignment is an action that could be taken. And a third option is to propose an audit that the board could prioritize. And really the function of audit is just to say, okay, there's something out there. It looks a little wonky. Maybe we need more information on that. Let's go do an audit and bring back information to inform if we could accept that or if we should assign it, what needs to happen. So that's kind of the three different actions that could be taken when risks are identified and assessed. So kind of transitioning from risk management to a risk-based audit plan. So internal audit, from that risk universe, we participate in risk management by evaluating how it's going and also helping to identify and assess risks. But we'll take potential risks and we'll bring them to the audit committee and say, hey, there's this risk out there. We think it's a high risk. It's compelling. Maybe we should do some more work. We'd like to prioritize an audit. So the audit committee will have a discussion about that, and if they feel it's appropriate, they'll make a recommendation that a project come to the board, and then the board would have final approval authority for a project, and then that will be added to the audit plan. And the audit plan is one of those things that we're going to start putting that on our webpage, give a little bit more information, try and say, hey, this is when we anticipate doing these audits. But the audit plan is risk-based, and it's what drives the work that internal audit does. Really quickly, before we leave the audit plan, a discussion on resources. We're required to report back to the board and let you know if we have enough resources to do the audits and things that we need to do. And I would say for monitoring as well, it's critical to understand, and it's definitely a policy and a priority for the board to consider how many resources you want to put into monitoring and auditing to decide, what they're doing in helping us reach our objectives or that strategic super sweet spot. So consider that. There's a lot of demands. There's a lot of programs and things that require attention, but where does monitoring and auditing fall in helping with the control and assurance that you want to get or to meet and achieve your objectives? So that's the pre-audit process. Once we've got the project on the plan, what is the process? And here's kind of high level, and really I guess we could have dialed it down to 3 different steps, but we blew up the reporting process. But there's a planning process, an analysis, and a reporting process. And at each step through there, we have a quality assurance process where the audit supervisor and myself review everything, all of our documentation, all of our work product to make sure that we're reaching sound conclusions. So audit planning, what does that look like? Sometimes it starts out simply and then it becomes something that maybe we hadn't thought it would be, but with our audit plan, we need to establish the scope and objectives of the audit. What does that look like? What time period are we looking at? We'll go out and research regulations and code. For the school fees audit, we pulled statute, we pulled rule, we pulled the permanent injunction. With the cactus audit, I mentioned we've gone to a training on cactus. We've talked with our subject matter experts here, just so we really understand the area before we dive in and actually do analysis and reporting. And it's important that we do that, and they've found and done studies in auditing that if we'll spend a little extra time with our planning, then we're more efficient through the other phases of the audit. So next is the analysis and documentation. So one of the outcomes of audit planning is an audit program that lists steps, and the steps are what help us achieve the scope and objectives of the audit. So we map out this path that we're going to take. We do things like gather evidence, maybe we'll take a sample, we'll go out and look at documentation, we'll speak to different individuals, we'll analyze data. Sometimes, and these are the other two pictures, we have what's called rabbit trails and hippo holes. Things that we're not expecting but that pop up. Rabbit trails are minor things that we can handle pretty well, but hippo holes, every once in a while you're like, whoa, totally did not plan on that. So what do we do with it? And either it's a discussion on, do we expand the scope and objectives of our audit, or do we just set that aside as a separate risk that is going to be looked at either in another audit or through risk mitigation in a different way? But that's the analysis and documentation phase of the audit. Then we get into the report, which is critical. And we start out with a draft report where we take information from what we call our work papers. We take that information, put together a draft report, and then we give a copy to the audit committee and also the audit client. And we have a closing conference and we talk through everything that is in that report. And that's where understanding is really established, is going through that report, talking about verbiage, talking about our conclusions, the criteria that we've used. From that meeting, if there's feedback, we'll take that back and look at it, and if it's appropriate and necessary, we will make changes to the report. We did that with the school fees audit. We had a great conversation in audit committee, took that back, made some structural changes to the report, formatting, that kind of a thing, and then brought back a revised version. And so with that revised version, a final draft we call it, we'll give that to the audit client, and then they have 14 days to provide us with an official response. We review the official response, make sure that it's pretty in line. If we have questions, we might go back to the client and talk about it again, or we have the option to write auditor concluding remarks just to ensure accuracy and clarity with the report. So then we have a final report that goes through the audit committee, who will recommend that the board release the report. And when the report is released, it is available on our website under public record reports. We keep, I think, 3 years of audit reports on the website right now, but we do have the older ones if anyone is interested. I did want to talk about the body of the report includes findings, and it's really important to understand findings and how they're set up. And really, not just for our reports, but any audit report that we receive, there will be the same elements. They might look a little bit different in the report, but the elements are the same. So the 5 elements are criteria, condition, cause, effect, and recommendation. The criteria is essentially what we go out and research in our planning, and we identify, what does code say we have to do? What does the Code of Federal Regulations say, or board rule or policy say? What should be happening? And this is really important to helping the audit client understand, is it a legal obligation? Like monitoring is a legal obligation for us. Do we have to do this? And if it's code or regulation, policy, likelihood is that it is a legal obligation, as opposed to best practice where, hey, the industry is doing this. This is benchmark data. This is a good idea. You should consider this. But criteria helps drive that decision on if it's a legal obligation or not. So it's critical to understand the criteria. Then there's the condition. What's actually happening? If the criteria is what should, then condition is what is happening, and there's a discrepancy there. And that's why it's showing up in a finding. So the condition helps us, and there's almost kind of this micro level of risk where the condition identifies a risk. And then right with that is the cause. Why did that happen? Why is the condition different than the criteria? And we really try and work with the audit client to identify the cause, because the recommendation, which we'll get to, needs to speak to the cause. The condition might be like a symptom of a cold. I have a runny nose, but really I have a virus. And so I need to treat the virus, not just my runny nose, which again is the condition, and then the cause is the true reason for the problem. So then there's the effect. What is the impact, or why should you care? And between the cause and effect, that helps you assess the risk. How serious is this? And then, as mentioned in the recommendation, recommendations are critical, but for internal audit, our recommendations are suggestions. I know audit from the state is ever a suggestion, but ours are suggestions because management has the ability to take whatever action they deem appropriate. And so they might look at something we put out there and say, well, we really don't think this is a risk. And there might be some discretion for them to make that decision. So really, they just need to address the cause, whatever that looks like. If it's based on the recommendation we give, great. If it's based on something else that we weren't aware of, great, as long as they're taking corrective action to address that cause. Now, that said, ours are a suggestion. Sometime audit reports from the federal government, in particular, maybe, it's more of a requirement, like, you're going to go do this. You need to do this. So be aware of that. Dependent on the audit shop, that recommendation might be more of a requirement than a suggestion, but I think that's pretty important to realize. And then I mentioned with findings and risk, findings are almost just, like I said, that micro level of risk consideration. The criteria, condition, and cause help identify risk, and then the cause and effect will help assess that risk. Then the recommendation is just, what action are you going to take? Are you going to accept it? Are you going to assign it out to someone? What needs to happen? So I thought this would be a fun little meme. When I met with the Access Committee, the Advisory Council, they said, are there any internal audit memes? And I was like, I really don't know. I've never searched for an internal audit meme. So I will admit, I made this one up. That's my cute nephew. But that's how we feel after audits, right? Let's do it again next year. Yeah. Anyway, I love spending time with my nieces and nephews, 23 going on 25 right now. So after the audit process is done, then we get to corrective action, and corrective action is critical. I was just reading an article in one of an internal audit publication that talked about the city of Atlanta, who their internal auditors said, hey, you're at risk for a hack, for some cyber concerns. And sure enough, they were hacked, and they got a ransomware demand. Ransomware means everything's tied up, right? You can't do anything. Your computers and system is locked down. And it cost them significantly because they hadn't taken the action needed based on their internal audit report. So really, an audit report is as good as the corrective action that follows. So the audit committee and internal audit, with the superintendency's input as well, we've developed several policies and procedures. We have forms now where we're really trying to track the status of corrective action, understanding that it is a management function. Management takes the action, but just having that assurance of, well, the action taken. So for internal audits of the state board, if it's internal here, we have a cover sheet essentially that we'd put on electronically to an audit, and it has just basic information about an audit, and then it also gives a 90-day status follow-up where we're going to come back and say, okay, who is the responsible individual, and how are things going? What does it look like for our findings, and have you taken action or not? Is there additional information? And then there's a space where it comes back to the audit committee to say, was sufficient action taken? If so, yes, let's close this out. And it's very formal, so everybody's aware of the status, which we feel is very transparent, and then we'll move on. Or if additional corrective action is needed, then that direction can be given to staff also. So that's internally. With our audits of LEAs, we say entities governed by or receiving resources from USBE, but our LEAs, other subrecipients, we have a little bit of a different form and process. And that process is essentially, we have a form, we have a cover letter. Internal audit prepares that and then gives it to the superintendency to check it out, make sure it's all in line, and then they send it to the LEA or subrecipient, who then has 180 days from the date of that letter to look at that, take action, and then submit this form back and say, this is the action we took, or we decided not to take action, and this is why. And then upon receiving that, internal audit gets those just for tracking purposes. We again give that to the superintendency, and they can have their staff look at that and say, is this sufficient or not, based on the finding, the cause, is it taken care of? And either we'll sign it off and say, yes, let's close it, or hey, a little bit more action is needed, this needs to happen. And we'll go through that process. But again, we think these forms will really help us to ensure that corrective action is happening. Again, the action that management feels is important to address the risks that are identified in our audits. So that's corrective action. So now I just want to go through just a few of the other things that internal audit does, and I'm going to kind of talk through those in relation to our performance initiative. And I think the performance initiative is something that has grown for internal audit. When I was hired and we started doing things, we didn't really call it the performance initiative, but that's what it's become. And here's kind of a timeline. I won't go through all of it, but essentially in 2015, with internal audit, I was the rehabilitation internal auditor, and then there were 3 education internal audit staff, and they all went to school finance. So I was the lone person in internal audit. But I was hired as the internal audit director, and at that point in time, I needed to hire staff and really figure out, okay, what's happening with internal audit. So in going through that process, hiring staff, looking at the standards that we have to follow, and the Utah Internal Audit Act says you've got to follow professional standards, we immediately recognized we need a policy and procedure manual. We need to start tracking our data, internal audits, external audits, hotlines. So we started tracking data. We put a policy and procedure manual together. All of those things started happening, and then we're required to do a self-assessment every year with an external validation every 5th year. So essentially audit the auditors. And we have to do that in order to use this language in our audit letters, our audit reports. It's a requirement, and we really wanted to get there. That was really important to us, kind of as a stamp of approval. So in December of 2016, we reached that milestone where we had our first self-assessment, and it was validated by an external peer group, some of our friends in other internal audit shops in the state. And then since then, there are other things that we've started doing based on their recommendations or based on process improvements we've thought we needed, like tracking our time by category, and then putting together performance reports so the board really understands what's internal audit doing, how are we spending our time. And then we're looking forward to 2019. We've talked about our communications plan, but we want to have our own strategic plan in line with the board's strategic plan. So we're looking at that, how we're going to do that and roll that out. But that's for 2019, what we want to do. What does that look like? Here's our self-assessment and our validated statement, which was quite a milestone for us. So just saying like, yes, we've done the validation, and then they did give us some feedback, and that feedback included % of time by activity. So you'll see these are the different categories where I have my staff and myself track our time every pay period. There are audit categories, there's hotlines, external audits, consulting. Our significant functions is what we want to capture. We wanted to make sure we didn't have too many categories because then it becomes onerous to track time. But this has been very helpful to us as we look at it and say, oh man, our meeting time is creeping up. What meetings are we attending? Do we need to look at that? Or hotlines, is it just that we have more hotlines, or are we efficient as we take hotlines? We need to know that information. So this tracking time by category has been very helpful. External audits, a little bit of data. This comes from our 3rd quarter performance report, but you can see that the State Department or the State Board of Education, we have a lot of external audits between the feds, the state auditor's office, the legislative auditor's office. We've been up over 20 audits the last 2 years that have been open. So there's some significant work that has to happen there. And internal audit is the external audit liaison, so we help facilitate a lot of that process. You can see percentage breakouts of who's doing the audits this year, federal and state, so that you're aware. Current audits in process by external audit agencies that are important and critical. In July, we anticipate the release of 2 reports from the Legislative Auditor's Office. That would be the school fees audit and an initiative programs audit of ProStart, Upstart, and Carson Smith, which these are both big audits, and we are anticipating they'll be released in July. Then we have, let's see, the State Auditor's Office has just started their financial audit and single audit. They're also doing a research project. They are doing, they're looking at the effectiveness of our financial literacy program. They will do an audit of Upstart and the minimum school program. So they're very interested in education, and that helps with our assurance function. And then we do have the feds that will be reporting sometime in the next few months on the 14-15 graduation rate, the data that we submitted for that. So we do have external audit reports that are coming. The external audit process and corrective action is very similar to the internal audit process, so I won't talk more about that, but just know that we do have a cover sheet. We're tracking status on that as well. And then just about hotlines for a minute. As of June 4th, our hotlines were up to about 147, so this is trending upwards. We get parents and students and LEAs and board members and employees. Anybody that calls in, anyone can call in because it's stakeholders of education with concern. And how do we handle that? Well, we have this flow chart, and I'm not going to go through all of it in detail, but you have information in your packet about that we do have a process, and we make sure we use that process for every call that we get. Being consistent is important to us, and being able to track through how we concluded when we receive hotlines is also very important. Some of the areas or categories of hotlines that we've received, opt-out, bullying, special education accommodations, if those are happening, education misconduct, those are types of hotlines that we get, and then we need to decide, is this relevant or related to the state board? Is it within our authority? And if it is it best addressed by the special education section or licensing or UPAC, or should internal audit take that to the audit committee as a risk to say what needs to happen here? So that's hotlines. We do informal consultations, and interestingly this year, these are just drive-by, like really quick. I have a question on this, I have a question on that, and we try and point people back to policy or regulation or their supervisory chain of command to make sure that we're not making management decisions, but that we're giving them information so that they can move forward with whatever question they had. But looking externally this year, we've had more inquiries from LEAs and maybe even our external audit agencies that have contacted internal audit, and we feel that's because they're trusting us. They want our feedback on things, so we feel like that's a good sign. And then just very quickly, networking and professional development is very important to us so that we can make sure we're providing you with the best service possible. And so we do take that seriously. We interact with other state internal audit agencies. I lead out and facilitate the group of state internal audit directors, and then also participating with a group of chief audit executives and risk managers with businesses within the state. So this is Questar and Flying J and the Church of Jesus Christ and higher education. There's a lot of people that come to these meetings, but again, so that we're on top of our game, and we want to lead out. We want to be the best internal audit shop there is in the state. That's very important to us, and we are committed to excellence. So going back to, we've talked about monitoring, we've talked about auditing, and it's all because we want to reach that strategic super sweet spot. We want to provide the service and help the board get there. And again, that's helping maximize the knowledge, the skills, the opportunities for our students now, and then their choices moving forward to benefit themselves, their families, their communities. And I'll just leave you with a quote. I heard this at two of the presentations that I was at this week with risk management. And it says, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." And what this tells me is that we can talk about strategy, and it's really important that we're moving along and we're trying to get to that sweet spot. But how we get there is really important as well, and it might even be, as this says, it's more important. So internal audit is really looking at our culture and what our core values are, and I've said we are committed to education, but we're committed to our families, we're committed to our health. All of those things roll together, and we believe as we manage that really well, we can come to work and we can be really effective and productive here. So those are things that we're looking at. We're excited moving forward, and we appreciate your support going forward. And if there are any questions, you probably just want to bail, but come visit us in the basement anytime. I'm happy to answer any questions now or later.
Thank you, Director Davis. We do have, I would like to take just a minute if we could, if anyone has any questions. I know Superintendent Dixon, if I can figure out how to work the mic, because I haven't done this before. So I just hit your name, on the green.
So I just want to give public appreciation for Debbie and her staff. They really model what they say. They really are a section that strives for excellence in every way. And Debbie's a great colleague, but she really models everything that you saw today. Debbie, I have a question for you, and I should have logged this slide, but it was the one where you had the pie chart about how you spend your time.
Yes.
How do you log that? I mean, is it just sort of watching time and logging it down? Sometimes when people are asked to do that, it seems very onerous. So I'm just wondering how you do that with your staff so that it doesn't cut into your day unnecessarily.
I kind of leave it up to my staff, and I let them figure out how they're going to track time. I think we've said doing it on a daily basis is the best way to do it, because sometimes if you wait a week and try and go back and recreate your week, it is onerous, and it's really an estimate. So we use the scheduling tool in Outlook if we have meetings or this or that, but really going in on a daily basis and just quickly saying, I'm working on an audit, I'm working on consulting, however you do it. I kind of just keep a little paper by my desk, and I'm like, okay, I did that for a half hour, and really half-hour increments. We don't want to get any smaller than that, because you're right, it does get onerous. But
so it's not software necessarily. It's it's hand. Okay. So do you use the Microsoft productivity thing at all that tells you how you spent your day?
I haven't. Well, I've looked at that every once in a while, but I don't have all the information there. So really, it's just we have a spreadsheet with all my employees, with all the categories. We have every day, and you just go in and put that information there. And then I can also, it's a reconciliation tool that helps me as I approve payroll also, to say like, oh, did we get everything right? You know, and so we've caught several things that way, as well as a tool, a control, to make sure our time is being reported accurately. But really, it's just an Excel spreadsheet that we're using right now.
Okay, awesome. Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from board members? All right. Well, thank you, Director Davis. It was a very informative presentation, so I really appreciate it. And I think we can do our best as a board to push that out and help people understand the function of audit. So we really appreciate you and your team, and give them our thanks. So.
Can I say one other thing? I
Yes,
forgot.
please.
With the packet that I gave you, there are cards for the hotline. I think we just did about 5 each. We have several more downstairs. So if you ever want more of those cards to pass out to people, if that's helpful, we have those, and we do just want to push those out there. Anyway, we have them.
I'd like a little JPEG, because I get a lot of
And that-
emails, and then I can just email
We'll do that
back
too.
that information.
Okay. Yep. Okay, we can do that.
Anyways,
Absolutely.
we appreciate it. Are there any other motions that we can't really make a motion. So since we have reached the end of our agenda, we will adjourn. And I apologize for the sparse numbers, but I know that myself, that I had a lot of things that I had to come and go from, and I know that other board members, we had 2 grandbabies being born this week, or maybe that's too personal to say, I apologize. But anyways, so thank you very much, and thank you. We will adjourn.